Aloha, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining us for Pacific Forum's sixth Comparative Connections Roundtable on the subject of U.S. Indo-Pacific policy in the second half of Biden's term. My name is Rob York, Director for Regional Affairs at the Pacific Forum, Editor at Comparative Connections, a triannual e-journal of bilateral relations in the Indo-Pacific, and your MC for today's event. For those of you who are not familiar with the publication, Comparative Connections is published 3 times a year, providing timely analysis on key bilateral relationships across the Indo-Pacific. A link to the key findings from our previous roundtable on the topic of China's foreign relations after the Party Congress can be found in the chat box now. Every issue of Comparative Connections is made up of 13 regular chapters, plus 1 rotating chapter appearing once yearly, each authored by recognized specialists who review critical developments within a given relationship and assess their implications for regional security, U.S. interests, and the future of the region at large. Each chapter also includes carefully curated chronology sections that synthesize the day-to-day policy developments, diplomatic engagements, and bilateral exchanges that outline the trajectory of each relationship. These chapter chronologies contribute to a running sortable chronology section of the website that dates back to the first issue of Comparative Connections in 1999. In addition to these analytical chapters and bilateral chronologies, the Comparative Connections website hosts 2 databases, a states visits database dedicated to tracking official visits by heads of state, and our multilateral forums database, which similarly tracks the occurrence of select high-level meetings. The various components of the site complement one another to provide users with a holistic understanding of each bilateral relationship's rich history, contemporary successes and challenges, and future areas for cooperation. A link to our most recent issue of Comparative Connections can be found in the chat box now. Today, to discuss U.S. Indo-Pacific policy in the second half of Biden's term, I will be speaking as co-author of our U.S. Korea chapter. I will be followed by my co-author, Dr. Mason Ritchie. Dr. Ritchie is Associate Professor of International Politics at Hankook University of Foreign Studies. See the chat box now for our most recent chapter. And our third speaker, but by no means our least, will be the author of our U.S. Southeast Asia chapter, Dr. Catherine Dalpino. She is Professor Emeritus at Georgetown University. For her most recent chapter, check the chat box now. And for our moderator, Brad Glosserman's co-authored chapter, please check the chat box now. I want to thank each of our distinguished participants for being here today. We look forward to your remarks and the fruitful discussion that will certainly follow. After our panelists' presentations, we will transition to a Q&A segment where we will welcome feedback and questions from the audience. I would now like to give the floor to our moderator, Brad Glosserman, Deputy Director at the Center for Rulemaking Strategies at Tama University and Senior Advisor at Pacific Forum.
Thanks, Rob. I've been called lots of things in my life. I think this is the first time I've been called Blad, but I'll take what we can get. It's a delight to be here. Thank you all for joining us, especially those of you in the audience. I hope that you're all familiar with Comparative Connections. I think it's an outstanding resource and one that has proven, I think, a site of just a fount of wisdom. And I think our program today is going to offer us an opportunity to prove that, or at least you guys better. My job here is essentially to just keep the trains running on time. And with that, I intend to be a fairly strict moderator, and we'll start with as in the order that Rob just outlined. So Rob, if you'll start us off with your thoughts about developments on the peninsula and U.S. foreign policy. Rob?
Yes, hello again, Brad. We've been doing these roundtables for going on 2 years, and normally I've been content to allow my distinguished colleagues to do the heavy lifting during them, but if there's any topic I can contribute to, it's this. Before we get into the parameters of how this administration has handled or will handle Indo-Pacific policy, I wanted to offer an assessment of the current state of U.S. politics in particular, especially following the midterm elections that took place last fall. I don't want to cover too many things that you already know, and most of you probably do know that the Republicans captured a narrow House majority, having lost the House previously in 2018, but making considerable gains in 2020. Many may also know that this was not repeated in the Senate, where despite a virtual tie in place since 2020, the Republicans performed poorly in several close races and now hold one seat fewer than they did a year ago. You may even know that historically this is very rare. The president's party usually does poorly in the midterms, especially when there are serious economic concerns, such as, for example, the worst inflation since the early 1980s. What you may not be sure of yet is the impact that this will have on foreign policy. And it's easy to say that the impact will be very little because foreign policy is not like economic policy. The president doesn't need congressional approval to meet foreign leaders, sign statements, bring his influence to bear on their policies, or even roll out agreements with them. Although, as was the case with President Obama's Iran deal from 2015, agreements that don't require congressional approval to enter into can more easily be abrogated by that president's successor. Nonetheless, in 21 and 2022, there had been concerns about Biden's reelectability and whether countries, including those not closely aligned with either the US or China, should bother to engage with him. These results may send a message to potential partners that Biden is not a spent force and that deals and agreements reached with him over the next 2 years are not a waste of time. In terms of specifics, there are some Republicans who have voiced skepticism about continued funding for instance, Ukraine, but partnerships and alliances in Asia are not similarly controversial. One critic of the Ukraine aid, for instance, is Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, and his argument frequently is that the aid that is going to Ukraine should be contrasted with that which could be going to Taiwan, and it should be going to Taiwan instead. All in all, policies designed to constrain the PRC are considerably more popular on that side of the aisle than those that are designed to constrain Russia. Speaking of which, the new House majority has passed a resolution to create a China Select Committee, as House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has long wanted. This committee would assess military, economic, and technological challenges that are posed by China, and McCarthy, being no stranger to partisan sparring with the Democratic Party, has explicitly positioned this as a bipartisan endeavor that he wants to encourage. He tried this first in 2020 when he suggested the committee then, only to see the idea shelved when COVID struck and there were concerns about how this would be perceived. This time, a resolution creating the committee passed by a vote of 365 to 65 suggests that it has bipartisan support. However, this now leads to a question of whether the two parties will prioritize bipartisan actions to strengthen the US's hand in the great power competition, or would they prefer instead to attack each other to put themselves in a better position for 2024? Speaking of McCarthy, it may be common knowledge at this point that he prevailed in the most protracted vote over the House speakership in a century and a half. What's less clear is precisely how this affects our emerging debate over the debt limit. Concessions McCarthy has made to the House Republican Freedom Caucus may have included demands related to the debt ceiling and refusal to lift it without spending cuts that the Democratic Party may balk at. The U.S. has, according to its Treasury Secretary, hit its debt limit and is now on extraordinary measures, essentially spending funds the government has but does not need yet. And President Biden has not expressed any interest in conceding as of yet, but the solution has to be found by the summertime. No one knows for sure what happens if the U.S. defaults on its debts, but just about everyone agrees it isn't good and may in fact be disastrous. Just the protracted wrangling that took place over the debt limit in 2011 led to a downgrade from the S&P, and that was the first time the U.S. had less than a AAA rating. Not great news amid questions about how reliable a partner the U.S. is, and with China seeking to position itself as a more dependable party. Also, after the midterm elections, there is always a rapid jockeying of candidates for the upcoming presidential election. Despite now being our oldest president, despite inflation, and despite the botched Afghanistan withdrawal, remember that? Biden looks like the Democratic Party nomination is still his. Former President Trump, who once seemed to have total control over his party, now faces questions as many of the Republicans who botched pickup opportunities in the Senate races were his choices specifically for the nomination. Other candidates will seek the party's nomination, and many of them are actually Trump administration alumni, it looks like. Former Vice President Mike Pence, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, possibly the former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, But for the time being, it really looks like a contest between Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. DeSantis was a bright spot for Republicans in the fall, as Florida, which was once a swing state that Barack Obama won twice, is now solidly red. He and the rest of Florida's Republicans overperformed. He is a favorite of party insiders who see him as able to accomplish tasks Trump started, but without the drama that Trump brought. But he is not the energetic campaigner that Trump is, nor does he inspire the avid devotion that the former president does. DeSantis is something of a blank slate on foreign policy, but has actively sought foreign investment in his state. And in the aftermath of Abe Shinzo's assassination in summer of 2022, took that as an opportunity to praise him and criticize China. Abe was, in his words, a heck of an ally, and he understood the threat posed by China. This indicates that regardless who our next president is, there is not likely to be a substantially different position on the Indo-Pacific, at least not in substance, perhaps in form. And no matter who the president is, they will have to deal with the Indo-Pacific in some form or another. Brad?
Thank you, Rob. Brief to the point, and appreciate that apt summary of the political situation, messy as it might be. Now, Mason, if you would offer us your thoughts, the vantage point from the Korean Peninsula, please.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. I'm grateful to Pacific Forum, both for the opportunity to speak today and also to write the Comparative Connections chapter on U.S.-Korea relations with Rob, which has been especially interesting this year. So basically, I think Rob did a nice job of covering the domestic political situation in the U.S. and notably with respect to a sort of brief retrospective on the Biden administration in the first 2 years, and then what's happened with the midterm election and how that might have some downstream effects on U.S. foreign policy, security and defense policy here in the region. So I will try to essentially move on from that. We can use that as a sort of basis going forward. And instead, I'm going to zoom out very, very briefly and look at sort of the overall picture for what I think the Biden administration has done until now. And to the extent that I'm diagnosing problems, I think that also essentially translates into what I think the priorities are for improvements in some way going forward. And then I'll talk some about the positives of the Indo-Pacific policy of the Biden administration, some of the negatives, and then come in and focus at the end specifically on Korea. So looking at things from an overall perspective, what ran through my head when I was thinking about what I could say about the Biden administration in the first 2 years, I had this expression that came to mind, from where I came from as a child in Alabama, when the expression is all sizzle, no steak, right? The idea that you've got a lot of activity and a lot of things that superficially look attractive, but like substantively, there's not as much there, or in some cases, anything there. And with the Biden administration, I feel like in some ways it's been all crisis, little strategy. And you can make an argument that, that's not entirely the Biden administration's fault. They came in, during a period when, the pandemic was, still in play. No one obviously asked, Russia to invade Ukraine. All of the problems that China causes, notably, for instance, with respect to Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. But to some degree, that's the job. And they've been pretty good about, I think, dealing with the day-to-day crises and the day-to-day diplomacy. But I think strategically, there's been a pretty significant lack of coherence. And I think that this is one of the things that they need to focus on going forward. And I mean that in a global context. Looking at some of the wins from the Biden administration, Rob briefly mentioned Afghanistan. And although the execution was poor, sticking with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and, actually managing to carry it out, even if in the processes it was extremely messy, I think that was a win. The U.S. was there for 20 years. Finally getting out, I think we can book that as a win. And I think the other significant win is the Biden administration's policy towards Ukraine. We don't know exactly where that's going to end up yet, but so far they've done a pretty good job, in my estimation, in dealing with a very tricky and difficult situation, notably with respect to bringing allies on board for some of the approach that the Biden administration has towards Ukraine. I'll come back to that. On the loss side, some things I think that they could have done better and significantly better, or lost opportunities. One of them is not getting back in the JCPOA. I think that's inexcusable, and why that's the case, I think speaks to a sort of strange cautiousness in the administration. And then lastly, economic statecraft has been extremely problematic, notably here in the Indo-Pacific region. And again, I'll come back to that. So that's kind of my sort of global look briefly. So coming to the Indo-Pacific and looking at some of the positives, I'm actually weirdly enough going to start back in Ukraine. The Ukraine issue is not just a Europe issue. It's an issue of global security order, which has downstream effects on the Indo-Pacific, and the underpinnings of state sovereignty, and the way that the United States and its allies have responded vis-a-vis the Ukraine crisis and the war that Russia is carrying out there, I think has effects, for instance, on the way that China looks at Taiwan, obviously, but more importantly, in some ways and more broadly, there's an effect, I think, of upholding the global security order, which I think is pretty significant. In a related way, getting Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand on board with sanctions, and in some cases, with aid to Ukraine, I think has also been a win. With respect to Taiwan, I think that's also been somewhat positive. The Biden administration has increased its presence in and around Taiwan. There are more hints at military support in the case of contingency, and I think the sort of overall a strengthening of deterrence vis-a-vis China and whatever designs China might have on Taiwan going forward. I'm less sure about the economic strategy that the Biden administration has with respect to Taiwan. They're essentially trying to decouple Taiwan from China and in technology and other supply high technology supply chain areas. And I understand why it is that they think that they need to do that, but I wonder if they might not be causing some unintended effects by making China overly dependent on the United States, which I think could have some backfire consequences. And to what extent it's really viable long-term for China and Taiwan to be separated in the technology space as much as the United States would like to see that happen. That's a species of a larger set of economic issues, which I'll come back to in a little bit. Diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, has been somewhat more based on values, quite a bit of rhetoric about human rights, political and civil rights. And I think the rhetoric actually matters, especially as a recovery from the Trump administration, where those things were very openly and brazenly thrown overboard by Trump, who simply didn't care about them and doesn't care about them. Now, the reality, of course, of U.S. foreign security and defense policy hasn't been quite as elegant. And of course, the way that the rhetoric matches reality, in some cases has been very stark, perhaps a little bit less so in the Indo-Pacific per se, but the way that the Biden administration has, for instance, cozied up to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the way that it hasn't taken a particularly tough line on Turkey, as well as any other number of authoritarian regimes that ultimately the United States continues to support in some way under Biden, I think is a rebuke perhaps to the full-throated support that I would like to give the Biden administration for its value-based diplomacy. And then lastly, in the Indo-Pacific, a positive area, I think Japan, South Korea cooperation, the emphasis on that has been solid. And I think it's very important in East Asia. And I think it's getting better in some ways. I think, to the extent that that hasn't been as great as we would like to see it, it's in some sense really the fault of Japan as much as it is, the Biden administration. And I think that there's some, clear momentum towards that getting better. On the negative side, I think the economic statecraft element is frankly speaking not very good in the Indo-Pacific, primarily because there's a missing part of the story for regional states here, and that's market access. The United States, has simply moved away from globalization. It's turned more protectionist, and its trade policy, in some sense, undermines its claim to a rule-based order that the Biden administration says it supports. So here there's a gap between rhetoric and reality again, and that has a real practical effect on countries here in the region who are, of course, whether we like it or not, next to China, which is in most cases their principal trade partner. And to the extent that the United States doesn't seem interested, in offering carrots, but rather seems primarily interested in offering sticks, even to its allies here in the region, I think that there's some long-term dangers in terms of the application of U.S. economic statecraft here in the region. This is a part of a larger problem, which is I think that the United States, to some degree, Washington, still somehow believes that it can continue to maintain regional primacy and hegemony going forward, or whatever it is that you want to call it. But frankly, it doesn't have, I think, the resources to maintain that, especially economically. And so I think that what the United States is trying to do is not to run faster itself, but to make China run slower. And I think ultimately, in the long run, that's a losing proposition. And then lastly, again, an Indo-Pacific negative, what is the end game on China strategy, right? Competition is an ongoing state, not an end point. And I think allies and partners here in the region, need to know what it is the United States is ultimately aiming at. And I don't think the Biden administration has done a very good job of outlining that. Lastly, in my final 2 minutes, turning to Korea, some of those themes that I just mentioned are going to come up in a very specific context here, and I'll be happy to take more questions, or Rob, can answer them perhaps as well or better than I can. I think there's a twin failure with respect to South Korea. The first of which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which has made South Korea very upset. And frankly speaking, the Biden administration hasn't answered that irritation very successful. And then extended nuclear deterrence for South Korea. Again, South Korea is extremely worried that with North Korea's growing nuclear and missile program, that extended nuclear deterrence is no longer credible. We can talk in great detail about the reasons why that's the case, notably with respect to North Korea's efforts, probably successful at some point in the future, to master tactical nuclear weapons, and how that forces on South Korea a fear that the United States won't trade San Francisco for Busan. We can go into the nuclear strategy side of that if everyone wants. I'd be happy to answer that. But I think the United States so far under Biden hasn't listened sufficiently, or at least acted sufficiently, with respect to either the Inflation Reduction Act or extended nuclear deterrence. With respect to North Korea, there really isn't a strategy, or at least not a very realistic one. The emphasis continues to be on denuclearization, which simply isn't going to happen. As everyone knows, North Korea is lower on the priority list than it has been historically. And I think we're headed towards a long-term deterrence relationship between the U.S.-South Korea alliance and North Korea. So a long-term nuclear deterrence relationship in a security dilemma environment where we don't have tools for risk reduction, or at least not very good ones. And I think that's a real problem. My final 2 points are positives. As I said, Japan-South Korea relations have been pushed forward by the Biden administration in a way I think that's been quite positive, and is much better than we saw under Trump. And secondly, I think the Biden administration has started prepping, they've started preparing South Korea for a future in which a potential Taiwan Strait contingency might involve the United States in its capacity as a power with bases and troops on the Korean Peninsula, and what that might mean for South Korea. And I think that discussion, although it has been held largely behind closed doors and South Korea is not really interested in hearing it, has nonetheless started to take place. And I think that's an important development in the US-South Korea alliance. So I will stop there. Thanks for listening to me. I ate up a little bit of Rob's time, which he ceded to myself and Catherine, but I'm very thankful that Brad didn't cut me off brutally like I could have expected.
Yeah, I'm getting soft in my old age. Thank you for that comment, Mason. To chew over, and we'll come back to it when in the discussion session. But I guess one of my first questions to you would be: do you really think that the Biden administration doesn't have a strategy, or is it just you don't like the one they've got? And while you're pondering that, Catherine, you're up, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I just have to say, as a native San Franciscan, I was alarmed to hear that the bargain would be trading San Francisco for Busan. We had always been told that it would be Los Angeles that would be sacrificed. So while I'm absorbing that, let me go on to Southeast Asia. Just a very brief look back at the Biden administration, because I want to look forward in these remarks. I think Biden has been reasonably successful in Southeast Asia in raising the U.S. diplomatic profile. It wasn't difficult. It was just a matter of going around the region and picking up the low-hanging fruit that Trump had ignored or spurned. Not unlike what happened in 2008 when the Obama administration came in and had a brief love affair with Southeast Asia. Also, I think that the administration has been successful in strengthening and restoring one of its two treaty alliances in Southeast Asia, which was the Philippines. That is probably more a function of Duterte's departure than Biden's arrival, but nevertheless it happened, so we'll put that in the plus column. I agree with Mason, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, that low marks are still there for economic engagement as the Asia-Pacific region defines it. The Biden administration would not agree that it doesn't have a strong economic engagement policy for the region, but I'll get to that. I want to look at 5 trends that probably we will see in 2023 and what we should look for in that. And looking back a little bit at 2022, first of all, I think that it's fair to say that in 2022, and we'll see more of that in 2023, there has probably been more of a strengthening between the United States and the maritime states of Southeast Asia on the perception, the mutual perception of China as a strategic threat to maritime security in the region. That doesn't mean that Southeast Asia is going to fall into the arms of the United States. It doesn't mean that Southeast Asian states won't continue to try and balance their relationship between the United States and with China. And it also doesn't mean that they will not vigorously pursue closer economic relations with China as well. It just means that there is a greater realization and a greater articulation, if you like, that China is an increasing security threat, at least in maritime affairs. And we saw that in a couple of ways. One was the crisis in the Taiwan Strait was very interesting for Southeast Asia. They tried to maintain that pristine point in the midpoint between the two countries. But there was a lot of recognition that if there is a war in the Strait, that Southeast Asia would be profoundly affected, not necessarily dragged into it, but profoundly affected. And moreover, that if China should take Taiwan, it is not good news for Southeast Asia, because it will certainly position China to be in a much better way to control Southeast Asia. And we must remember that Japan, and here, Brad, you are the expert, I'm not, but the understanding is that Japan used then Formosa as a springboard to conquer the Philippines and Indonesia in part. So I think that there's an awakening of this in the region and a greater willingness to talk about it. And good heavens, I've used a lot of time already, but I'm going to keep on with my speed wrap. Also, there is China continues to harass Southeast Asian vessels in South China Sea. And also there are revelations that China is beginning to build again on island features that people had assumed they would not build on. So there is momentum there. Secondly, is that another sort of downward trend is that the United States is losing steam in mainland Southeast Asia. And I don't want to be absolute about that. I want to be relative about that. But there are several things. One is either the creeping or overt or raging authoritarianism in that sub-region. And I would include Thailand as creeping authoritarianism. And on the overt side, obviously Vietnam, but also Myanmar. The Lao debt situation was revealed in October by the World Bank to be worse than had been thought, and that the Lao debt probably exceeds the annual GDP, and about 60% of that is to China. And Laos has not been successful in getting China to renegotiate that debt to any extent as well. And I don't want to dwell too much on Myanmar. I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but there is very little reason to be optimistic in the near term for a more democratic or even a resolution at all to the conflict in Myanmar. At the same time, this has been a boon to both Russia and China, and I'll speak in a minute about how Southeast Asia looks at that as well. US relations with Thailand are okay. They're not as flourishing as they could be. Relations with Vietnam are okay as well. But one of the things that you're seeing in the region, in Thailand, Vietnam, and to a lesser extent Myanmar, but in the sub-region, is you're going to see elections, you're going to see political transitions. Obviously in Vietnam, there has been a recent transition within the party. But pretty much, I think that the United States is really sinking fast in that. One thing to look at will be, a couple of things to look at, will be if Myanmar has elections in the summertime, unquestionably the military or a military-backed party will win. There's no suspense there. But what are the governments of mainland Southeast Asia going to do? My guess is that more than one of them will recognize that government against the protests of the United States and the West. I would say possibly all four will recognize that government. And in December, Thailand held a regional meeting, which they labeled a non-ASEAN meeting about Myanmar. They invited the Myanmar military. They invited all of the ASEAN states to send foreign ministers, and only Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia sent foreign ministers. And I think that speaks pretty well to where the sub-region is on Myanmar. The election in Cambodia will be very interesting. Unquestionably, the Cambodian People's Party and Hun Sen will win in July, but there is some talk that Hun Sen may then pass the mantle for prime minister to his son, Hun Manet. And this may be an opportunity for Cambodia to push the reset button with the United States, which I think it wants to do very much. And here, although Hun Manet, who is commander of the armed forces, is not necessarily going to be any more liberal than his father, he's a graduate of West Point. And so this is perhaps an opening to reconfigure the relationship in a more positive direction. I don't want to overstate that, but that is possible. And also there will be an election in Thailand that's more damage control, because it does not look like there's going to be a more democratic outcome. Either Prayut will win, or Prawit, his former co-leader in the 2014 coup, will win, or Puatai, Thaksin's party, will win. But we have known from our own experience that doesn't necessarily mean it will be more democratic either. So I think it's going to be a pretty long haul. It would be good if the United States were a bit more active on the US-Mekong partnership, because that's really our only sub-regional institution that we have with Southeast Asia. And given climate change and a lot of questions about what's happening in the Mekong with the dams and electricity, I think this would be a good entry point. There's another sort of downward trend, and that is one that Mason has already talked about, which is the economic engagement of the United States. On December 6th, the Australian Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, was in Washington, and she blistered the Biden administration on that score in an address to the Carnegie Endowment, in which she said that we have a very lackluster economic engagement that is against our strategic interests. The problem is that that's not going to change. What Australia and Southeast Asia talks about when they talk about US economic engagement is US entry into multilateral free trade agreements. That's simply not going to happen in 2023 or 2024. The first possibility might be after the elections in 2024. And specifically, the United States probably is not going to consider entering the CPTPP. They do have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which I don't think Mason mentioned, which is supposed to conclude in late 2023. That's not going to have market access, but it is going to be more of a flagship program. We'll have to see what comes out of it. I have to say, however, that the Republicans are already telling the embassies of the countries that are members of IPEF not to get their hopes up, because IPEF is based in an executive order. It's not a congressionally approved law, and they are saying that it can be easily quashed with an executive order on the first day that a Republican president takes office, possibly in 2024. So it's not a very strong position, but it's really not something that's going to change. Let me talk about two emerging trends, and I will be very fast. One is the very interesting trend, and it's very cautious and it's very incremental to multilateralize security cooperation in Southeast Asia with the United States and its allies. And specifically, this means bringing Japan and bringing Australia in more, particularly in maritime security. And we're seeing the sort of kernel of this with the Japan-Philippines agreement to begin joint cooperation, however it's defined. The region is certainly dependent on Australia for a lot of things, but it's still very wary of AUKUS and where that might go, and wary of the nuclear issue. Again, that will be very cautious, not only to minimize alarming Beijing, they're not going to be happy anyway, but also because there are doubts in Southeast Asia about expanding cooperation with more external powers. They want to see where Prime Minister Kishida is going to take his defense reforms, see where those lines are. And of course, again, they want to see what's going to happen with AUKUS. But it's an interesting thing to watch. I think signs that the trend is increasing will be that if that Japan-Philippine nucleus expands to include one or two other countries as well. And I'll end on this, another interesting emerging trend is the increasing geostrategic competition for clean energy in Southeast Asia. And we had two flagship agreements in late 2022, one for the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, of which, of course, Japan is the largest donor, with Indonesia, and a second with the G7 in December with Vietnam. And both of these programs are to support coal plants with the understanding that they will be taken offline sooner than originally planned as a decarbonization strategy. This is fairly controversial because climate change activists say, why don't you just put the money into renewable energy instead of this phase down with coal plants? And the answer to that is because it's not just a transition in energy, it's also an economic transition. And that you really have to have both of these going on at the same time. It will be interesting to see if any more countries sign on to similar agreements like that in 2023. The next candidate probably is the Philippines, which I think is the third largest polluter in the region, Indonesia being the first, Vietnam being the second, and the Philippines being the third. Another one is the competition for nuclear energy, to which Southeast Asia is warming gradually. If you talk to the scientists, they say that about 4 or 5 Southeast Asian countries are scientifically ready to move forward with nuclear energy. If you talk to the public opinion pollsters, they will say that none of the publics in Southeast Asia have a majority support of that. And that is certainly true. I mean, all of the polls say that, but that will be a topic for discussion. If Southeast Asia turns to nuclear energy, Russia will be very much in the game. They got, I think, the second contract for Vietnam before Vietnam decided to kill all its contracts for nuclear energy with the meltdown of Fukushima in 2011. So you'll see, I think, some very, very interesting and very, I think, vibrant competition, not only with the United States, Japan, certainly Russia, China as well. China is not really up to speed with those other three, but it is trying to retool the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, to emphasize more clean energy projects. It's stopped funding coal projects, and it's especially going to target those for Southeast Asia. So I will stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. It's a good thing that Rob is so succinct, and both you and Mason are able then to flot your time constraints. And it's a good thing that we're doing this virtually, and I can't wrap either of you over the knuckles. Thank you both, or all three of you actually, for some really great presentations and covering a lot of ground. I want to remind everyone that our focus here really, because this is an incredibly rich topic, quite obviously, of all the developments in the region, that we're focusing ostensibly on the US foreign policy and the Biden administration 2 years later, which is where both of our speakers began and largely stuck to their remarks. But I want to make sure that we kind of stay on point, given the great diversity of potential topics that we've got. I would note that if we're trying here to have something of a conversation, and we've got some great folks among the attendees, so you don't always have to ask a question. You can offer a comment We ask, of course, that your comments always be shorter than the presentations themselves. If you want to be succinct, you can, of course, always put your question in the Q&A box as well. So you have two options to write a question. We have four, or you can raise your hand, in which case I will call on you. I'd like to just pose a couple of questions, and what I'd like to do is take several before we go back to the speakers themselves. And I guess number one would be what all of you have alluded to, the swing in US policy. And so I'm wondering, to what degree does whatever Biden do still suffer from a perception or fear that it would be undone by a subsequent administration were the White House to change hands again? And I would ask, given the number of folks among the attendees that are from the region, be happy to hear your thoughts about this. Secondly, Catherine, Mason wants to see more attention to human rights. How does that work from the Southeast Asian perspective? To what degree do we find is there a tension there? Third, for you again, my question is, in our conversations in the region, I don't sense, for all the certain ambivalence regarding how to deal with China, a great deal of diversity, with some exception, in views of what Chinese behavior and intentions are. And so I'm wondering, to what degree the question is really what the US response is, and how it is that we maximize the coalition that's available to address these concerns. And I would just note to the entire audience, to follow up on your point about Japan-Philippine cooperation, that the Pacific Forum late last year held a trilateral US-Japan-Philippine meeting that I believe the report is on the website that Jeff or Daniel ran. And I would urge those of you that are interested in looking at the possibilities for expanded cooperation in the region to please look at that report. In addition, I want to, we can look at the questions that we have. Bill Sharp has served up a couple of questions, Catherine, for you about the impact of the US change of its policy toward Taiwan from strategic clarity to strategic ambiguity, and how Southeast Asians would react. And he's also asking about which country has the greatest influence in Southeast Asia. Rob, you've got a question also about Taiwan and the impact of the trend. And Joe Black asks that Thailand is leaning more towards the US. And I guess that the way that we'll go back to the speakers in order to take those, and we'll give you each a few minutes, 5 minutes, if you don't mind, per speaker to address the questions as you wish. But I guess in particular, thoughts about the way in which perhaps that President Biden has handled Taiwan, and the degree to which you see that as becoming an issue in the relationship, and how, from the perspective of the region, it should be best addressed. Rob, why don't we start off with you, and everyone can handle the questions they feel most comfortable with, and no need to go 5 minutes, but at 5, I'm going to start looking angry. So Rob, if you'd start us off.
I tend to be on the succinct side, so no worries there. There's been a steady climb in U.S. politics toward additional recognition of Taiwan, I'd say, over the last 6-7 years, perhaps starting when President-elect Trump took a call from Tsai Ing-wen in late 2016. There's been additional steps that have been taken since then. See, Paul Ryan visited the island. He waited until he was out of office, of course, but it was nonetheless something that got attention. Nancy Pelosi's visit, of course, took place last summer, and we all know how that went. It is something of a surprise that Kevin McCarthy is announcing his plans to visit Taiwan as early as he is in this tenure that he has recently reached. As to whether or not it will set a precedent, I think one thing that has to be acknowledged is, okay, in addition to Kevin McCarthy having very strong views on China, hence his pushing for this China Select Committee for the last couple of years, is that Nancy Pelosi also has a history with China as well. She had a very famous visit to China in the early 1990s, where she offered a kind of protest of the Tiananmen uprising suppression that had taken place just a couple of years prior to that. Now, as far as whether or not this will set a precedent, we don't really know how long Kevin McCarthy will be in office. He may not make it very long based on things that we have seen so far. Well, among the conditions that we believe the House Freedom Caucus put on him is that it might be very easy to object and call for a new vote very soon. And if the Republicans were to lose the House in the next election, for instance, then the House Speaker would in all likelihood be Hakeem Jeffries, the current Democratic leader, who does not have the same history with China and with Taiwan that Nancy Pelosi has. He very much is a blank slate on foreign policy in general. So whether or not he would visit Taiwan is a little bit harder to predict. The general trend toward Taiwan, Taiwan has been it's been a kind of sort of a cause célèbre lately because of its reputation as a human rights beacon. We've heard references to the human rights and democratic backsliding in the region, and Taiwan has been very much an exception to that. They are held up very much as a model to that, and so they are a country that it is very popular, at least at the moment, to show support for in that way. So expect them to receive continued attention from U.S. politicians who are looking to basically shore up their reputation for hawkishness on China, you could say. Biden's own handling of it, well, there were very much concerns about whether or not he was going to continue the emphasis on Taiwan, where he was going to continue to give them that attention, but he has really met that, I'd say, and more, having it's said on multiple occasions that he's willing to come to Taiwan's defense if they come under attack. And also, as it's been noted, they have really tried to hamstring China's development of high technology as well. So, yeah, people have said that Joe Biden is in some ways emblematic of the mainstream Democratic consensus, which is we invested a lot of energy in China in the hopes that it would change, a lot of resources in China and hope that it would change, and it did not change, and therefore we feel betrayed.
Well, that was succinct. Thank you, Rob. Mason?
Okay, so I'm going to start with a brief I don't know, response / apology to Catherine for threatening San Francisco earlier.
Thank you.
So I use San Francisco. This is gonna get me in trouble. I somehow feel that like LA is a more emblematic U.S. city. I mean, the typical way that you hear, maybe this has changed now because of Google and all the tech out there, but like the sort of, I guess I'm old enough like to remember when San Francisco wasn't considered as important as LA. So, and I think, it's important and the reason why I say that actually has a kernel of something, important to it. And that is, when we make this distinction, or when we make this claim that, the US wouldn't trade X city for Y city, the typical thing that people have in the back of their heads is the Cold War dictum of not trading New York for Paris. And I just don't think that like what the way that things work on the peninsula is exactly analogous, because I don't think that Pyongyang, if they were to lob an ICBM towards the United States, it wouldn't be towards New York or even Washington, I don't think. So I don't want to make to me the exact comparison would be trading Washington for Seoul, but I don't think that that's the trade that's on the in some like crazy world that I don't think we're ever going to be in. But nonetheless, in the crazy world like that, I don't think that's the trade that's on the table. I think it's Busan for San Francisco for operational reasons and for, a lot of other reasons. Anyway, Brad, I'm going to go to your question first. No strategy, or I just don't like it. Okay, so I'm going to start by saying I have a pretty high bar for strategy. So I'm almost never convinced by a strategy. Like I don't think I've ever seen one where I thought to myself, yep, or at least in like modern history. Like I don't think I've ever seen a strategy roll out and I'm like, yep, that convinces me. And that's not just the United States. That's true of Europe. That's true of states here in the region. I have a pretty high bar for strategy. And the reason that I think I have a pretty high bar for strategy is that I think strategy requires the application of means for realistic ends. And it's pretty hard ultimately, I think, for for politicians and policymakers to successfully meet that equation. And that there's a lot of different reasons for that. It involves bureaucracy, and the way that, the policy making, is done, the way that the sausage is made. It involves the fact that politicians, have time horizons which are inconsistent with, those of, national security. It involves, trade-offs that politicians don't like to make. It involves simple incompetence. And so I think I have a high bar for strategy. And in the case of, the US and the Indo-Pacific, I think on the positive side of things, when we look at the means that are available, I think rhetorically, the means have been there. Certainly the United States has been there in the region, much more diplomatically present, which is important, obviously, for states in the region. And as I said, I think there's been a real, actual strategic benefit and a strategic, application of resources towards an end. With Japan, South Korea, US trilateral cooperation increasing. You can make the argument that AUKUS is a part of that, although I think that the damage that it did to the relationship with France shouldn't be overlooked. But ultimately, the means for a successful end in the region, and I'll come back to that problem in just a second, so far it doesn't involve this economic component in a way that I think is substantial. And I think, Catherine's pointed that out too in some ways. And, if the economic part of the means aren't there, then you're not going to be able to achieve whatever ends it is that you're aiming at. And right now, the US is hanging its hat on IPEF, which, Catherine mentioned earlier, this Chip 4 alliance and export controls vis-a-vis China. And I think for each of those, there's a problem. And one of them goes back to your point, Brad, which is, well, what's going to happen if another administration comes in? I think another administration, the easiest thing on the chopping block is probably IPEF, right? If you were to have a Republican administration come in with a sort of general philosophy of Trump, where things like, standards and multilateralism, are an important part of the toolkit. The Chip 4 type alliance, some of the export controls, I can imagine Republican administration using that. But I think that, IPEF, which is the flagship, economic strategy of the US, it would be the thing that would be potentially on the chopping block for a next administration. As Catherine said, apparently Republicans have already been telling their Southeast Asian counterparts that that might be the case. And that's in addition to the fact that even if IPEF were to continue to exist, it doesn't have this market access dimension. And as Catherine also mentioned, the US has no interest in coming back into the CPTPP or these other, multilateral trade agreements that provide market access. So I think in some sense, the means half of the strategy equation isn't there. And if we're talking about the ends, well, again, what is the end with respect to China, right? As I said, strategic competition is not an end state. It's an ongoing process. But what's that supposed to lead to? Ultimately, I think what hasn't been said is that the US wants a containment policy in all but name. And I just think that that's unrealistic. So I think the means half of the equation on strategy doesn't check out. And I think the ends half of the strategy doesn't check out. Now, whether or not, you think that that's just me not liking it, maybe that's a semantic question. That being said, yeah, go ahead.
It's been 6 minutes. So what I'd like to
sorry.
do. No,
okay.
Why don't
sorry.
we tell you what, let's stop there for it's a convenient break point. We don't have, well, I don't have any additional questions or hands up. So why don't I go to Catherine and she'll take her question, and then we can continue this in the absence of any additional interjections. But Catherine, the floor is yours if you don't mind.
Thanks. Let me just go through 4 of the questions, and Brad, please prompt me if I've forgotten any of the questions that were asked. Does Biden, has he come out from under the shadow of Trump in terms of fears that an America First politician will get back into the White House perhaps in 2024 and reverse all of what Biden has said? No, he has not come under that shadow. He can't come under that shadow. There is no way in Asia or even in Europe that our allies or that anyone is going to think that the United States is back on a mid path for good. I mean, I think that's, and I don't think anybody in the United States thinks that either. In terms of human rights, the United States does not put human rights at the center of its foreign policy, despite what people think. The only person who tried to was Jimmy Carter, and that didn't work out all that well. The targeted sanctions were a gift to political administrations because they did allow them not only to target smart sanctions to the true perpetrators of human rights, but also perhaps to skirt around some things that might hurt US interests. But I would say that with respect to Southeast Asia, first of all, there is a slight discomfort that the coup in Myanmar in February 2021 happened just a week or so after the insurrection against Congress in Washington, or actually about a month. And actually there were parallels drawn in the region to the two, and there was some suspicion that the military in Myanmar thought this would be an okay thing to do given what they had seen. So, and Biden very wisely sort of started to turn the rhetoric away from the defense of democracy, holding the United States up as, you know, a beacon of that, even with the changing of the summit of democracies to the summit for democracies. There are two old situations, I think, that the United States and other Western countries have resigned themselves to, and one is Myanmar, which nobody in Washington thinks is going to improve anytime soon. You don't have that championing of icons. Nobody is talking about Aung San Suu Kyi in Washington, just as in Cambodia, nobody's talking about Sam Rainsy. So I think the difference is that we're no longer looking for what American administrations look for at the end of the Cold War, which was the one person, the dissident or the one opposition leader, who, if you could only get that person into power, was going to totally turn the system upside down. I think that is gone. I think that the United States and the world has come to a little bit more of a realpolitik. The difference is going to be some of the human rights issues on some of the countries that we are improving or strengthening relations with. And the business with Marcos is still sort of out to, you know, the jury is out on that. There is a lot in the past. We even have specific issues with him, not just with his father or his mother. And we don't know still what he's going to do with Duterte's anti-drug campaign. That will be something that will be very telling. Indonesia has passed a criminal revision to its criminal code, which, if it's actually applied, could be very draconian. Particularly with respect to freedom of expression, but also tolerance for other religions and things like that. But in general, I think that US human rights policy sort of goes along on its own path. Biden has been supportive in rhetoric. His approach is less ideological than the Trump administration's was, though. And I think that I would certainly point to Mike Pompeo's use of ideology in human rights. And I think that it has been a good thing that he's backed down, that Biden has sort of changed the rhetoric. Let me address two questions in one, which was this question of, do Southeast Asian leaders share the same view of China as a threat? Yes, they do, but they don't share the same feeling of how that will affect them individually. So Thailand does not necessarily see China as a benign player on the security side, but they do not feel that they are as vulnerable as the Philippines, as Vietnam, even as Indonesia or Malaysia, and they're probably right. But actually their fears are somewhat different, and they have to do with connectivity. I mean, Thailand has really dragged its heels on that next part of the rail line that China wants to go through. They've got the China-Lao rail line. Now they want the Laos-Thailand rail line, so you can have a clean shot from Kunming down to Bangkok and eventually down to Singapore. And Thailand just finds all kinds of reasons why they just can't quite do it yet. And the reasons are mostly security as well as debt. So Thailand is not, in my view, in danger of being taken over by or even dominated by China. They are far too skillful in the way they have played the diplomatic game. There is still a strong feeling that their relationship with the United States is important. Vietnam has its own built-in brakes when it comes to China, as we know. It's those smaller ones. It's Laos, Cambodia, and chaotic Myanmar, I think, that really are at risk. But let me finish with Taiwan. I think I'm the only person on this feed who's actually sitting in Washington now. I don't agree that there has been a change from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity, no matter what Biden says, which his handlers then walk back. I don't think anybody really thinks that in Washington. And one of the reasons that Pelosi, and you will see McCarthy doing this, will go out as speaker to Taiwan isn't only to raise the flag, but also to remind the administration that if you read the Taiwan Relations Act, the administration cannot decide that they are going to defend Taiwan unless they have Congress's approval. And that is an attempt to remind them that Congress is a major actor in Taiwan policy as well. I don't see much sentiment to go to war for Taiwan. In fact, the Taiwanese have taken Ukraine as a cautionary tale. I think that, yes, the United States will put all they can into weapons and other sort of indirect supports, in part so as not to have to make a direct intervention. How does Southeast Asia see that? I think that there's a scale. I think Philippines rightly considers that it would be on the chopping block if there were a war in the Strait. And that particularly if China were successful in taking Taiwan. So probably, and nobody will say this aloud, but probably the Philippines would come under pressure to use the VFA and flexible basing as one spring point for the defense of Taiwan if the United States and its allies try to do this. They might even, under some circumstances, welcome that for its own good. There is a feeling, and it's just an assumption, I have no access to classified information, but that Singapore under the table might also cooperate in some ways. The others would prefer not to be seen as cooperating, but at least, you know, might be amenable to sort of disjointed incremental efforts to help contain China in that. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Catherine. We've covered a lot of ground. I appreciate it. Let me reserve. We've got a couple more questions in the Q&A, and I'll serve them up if I may. And Mason, I think you still have a couple of points you wanted to make. First, I would going back to this question of economic strategy that both you and Catherine addressed, and I'm wondering again in this notion of matching ends to means, if in the recognition that the United States, again, or the Biden administration is not prepared to put market access on the table, reflects an actual acknowledgement of political reality in Washington. And thus, again, while it doesn't make us happy, and while we would all agree that there does need to be, I think, more carrots, that in fact, this is a recognition. And it also corresponds, I think, to what Jake Sullivan had argued prior to joining the administration. I think it's repeated since then, the need to do this foreign policy for the middle class. And so I'm just wondering if as unhappy as I am, and you are, about, if you will, the limits of economic engagement, whether it doesn't also reflect a certain political reality in Washington, unpleasant as that may be. I'll give you a chance to respond to that in a second, Catherine, because I want to just run through this quickly and allude to two of the questions, and then go back to the speakers. Secondly, it strikes me that you referenced, and I think it's been part of this discussion, but to me, a real hallmark of the Biden administration policy is its readiness to rely on allies. And I think there are certain steps that we've seen which have been real empowering towards Japan, towards South Korea in particular, and that as well the encouragement of the new networking of relations. AUKUS has come up quite interestingly enough. None of you mentioned the Quad, and so it's just kind of curious to me that hasn't gotten any attention as yet. So how is it that you envision, or how do you credit the Biden administration 2 years in encouraging this denser weave of relations among allies, and how well that serves US policy and the degree to which it survives this administration? And then related to that are Don Kirk's questions in the queue that say, Mason in particular, but I suppose Rob as well, just how blithely and positively optimistic you are about Japan-Korea relations. And Don is quite skeptical about the insouciance, or just the casualness with which you think that the South Koreans are going to accept Japan's new defense documents and the increasing of its capabilities, and what that bodes for tensions between them, and then of course for crisis management in the region in the longer term. So with that, again, let's go back to the speakers. Each time, we still have some time left, in the absence of additional questions in the queue, I want to give you each again 5 minutes. And that, in theory, gives us time to speakers or attendees to pose one more question, but brevity is to be appreciated, just so we can get another round in. Mason, or Rob, I'm sorry, you up first.
Okay, I'll start by, first of all, backing Mason up. I don't believe the Biden administration has a strategy on North Korea either. I think that has been pretty true of administrations in general when it comes to North Korea, or at least they come in with a blanket assumption, and that assumption is usually framed by how their predecessors handled the question of North Korea. And basically they attempt to do what their predecessor did not. This has been true, I think, ever since Bush took over from Clinton, we're going to move away from the agreed framework. Then Obama came and said, we're going to move away from confrontation and outstretch our hand. And then his first Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, said explicitly, we are going to move away from strategic patience. And I guess at this point, Biden's probably looking at North Korea and wondering if there's anything left. That's how it seems to me. Most of the initiatives they have taken, such as their policy review, were ultimately not really revealed to the public. And that seems to be a cue to me that they don't really have a lot of ideas left on how to handle that situation. So regarding the question of Japan's defense strategy and how that is perceived in Korea, I'm curious that Donald has left in the question of, Korea and other nations in the region and how they will welcome the prospect of Japan's technological advancements in this field. And one of the things that we covered when we did our series on Shinzo Abe and his legacy in the region was really how he had repaired relations with Japan, or really built up relations between Japan and many of the countries across Asia, whether it's India, whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's Taiwan. So I'm a little curious about what other countries he's referring to. Korea is, of course, a question, and how they will respond to the Japan's defense buildup. I was having dinner with a friend of a friend about this, and one of the things that they mentioned was, do you trust Japan? And my question was, compared to who? Compared to what? It certainly is clear to us what their defense buildup is in response to. This is coming at a time when I think there is a South Korean administration that is really willing to work toward better relations with Japan. And consequently, I don't think we've seen the full extent of how Japan and its defense upgrades are going to affect Korean society. Mason may be able to comment more on that, but we're certainly at a high point, I guess, in Korea-Japan relations, which is not saying a lot, but there could always be possibility of those lows returning. So I'll pass it over.
Thank you. Mason?
Sure. I'll also address the last question first, from Don. Hi, Don. Nice to hear from you again. Your question was typically pointed exactly as I would expect. So just, I mean, it was, why I didn't mention it, or why we didn't mention it, at least in my case, I mean, it was just a question of time. I was already over time for both my initial remarks and my answer to previous question. And that being said, I do want to echo Rob a little bit, where, your question references other countries. And I'm also curious, what it is that that perhaps I don't. When I look at how Taiwan thinks about Japan's, defense buildup, I see them quite supportive of that. When I think about Australia, I also don't see Australia worried about that, or New Zealand worried about that, or the Philippines worried about that. So I'm also curious as to who the other countries are that you're referencing. I will admit that, at least on paper and in theory and in history, you would think that Korea would be worried about it. And I think if this were the Moon Jae-in administration, you would find quite a bit of rhetoric, in public by the Moon administration in one form or another, or whatever successor progressive administration that would have used that probably as much for domestic political point scoring as anything else. But the current conservative Yoon administration seems intensely relaxed about this, at least in public. And to the extent that I've had, private conversations with people, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in the Defense Ministry, they don't seem worked up about the Japanese buildup. Now, I would zoom out for a second and say that this goes back into my larger strategy point, where I'm concerned that we have an arms race in East Asia. Now, I'm not saying that I necessarily support Japan doing the things that it's doing. I don't really have an opinion, and ultimately it's their national sovereign choice. I think Japan probably should at the end of the day. It seems to make sense. Well, I'll be interested to see how much it actually turns into reality. These types of, increases in defense expenditures sometimes don't cash out the way that we think that they're going to. So I'll be interested to see how much that, becomes reality. And I'm concerned, going back to the strategy question, that the Biden administration and successor U.S. administrations are going to have a hard time figuring out how to keep the arms race in East Asia from continuing. And I'm not blaming Japan or South Korea or the US or any other country for arming up. Ultimately, I think the problem here is China, and the responses to that are extremely tough. But I think that this arms race is something to be worried about. And I think, to me, this is perhaps in some sense the more significant question. Do I still have a couple of minutes, Brad, or should I stop talking now and let Catherine go? Okay, so to go back to the to go back to your second point there, Brad, you mentioned about is to what extent is with the economic statecraft, is this just an acknowledgement of reality? I admit it. Yeah, of course, the Biden administration is operating under domestic political constraints that are already beginning under the Obama administration, and certainly were accelerated enormously with respect to free trade and globalization under the Trump administration. And Biden picked up the baton at that point. But again, I have a high standard, and maybe I'm too much of an idealist, but the point of being a political leader is to be a leader. And if that means taking your country into an unpleasant direction with respect to domestic politics, then that's what you should do. Now, I'm not saying I expected them to do that, but it's what you should do. And they're not. And at the end of the day, Jake Sullivan's, and so a lot of people were already arguing this, and perhaps I should have believed them earlier. A lot of people were saying his famous, foreign policy for the middle class speech was just a thinly veiled version of protectionism. And I think that's in some sense what it is. Now, you can simply say, well, that's just domestic political reality, and that's what we should expect them to do. But at least with respect to national security going forward, I think it becomes a problem, because to the extent that protectionism ends up being done partially on the back of companies and workers in Korea and in Japan and in Southeast Asia and in other places, in the long run, that's going to have consequences for how those countries look at the United States, especially vis-a-vis China. And so that's where I think the domestic political side of it and the international political, or the security dimension of that come together. And I don't think that strategically this is a very smart play going forward. Maybe a smart play politically for 2024, but that's to me not what strategy is about, at least not in terms of international security and national security. Political is, of course, a different issue. I have some other things I could say about strategy, but I'll stop for the moment and let others go.
Thank you. Thanks, Mason. I think, the comments that you just made in some ways echo the reception that Senator Manchin got in Davos when he was trying to make the case for IRA, the Inflation Recovery Act, in the face of considerable opposition from the Europeans. And his argument would be a stronger America, one that's more united on these issues, is one that's better for the world. You could take that one and I suppose $4.25 and maybe get a coffee with it, but nevertheless at Starbucks or some upscale place. But nevertheless, I think that's the argument that's made, and I have a feeling this is a discussion that you and I will be having, and many others, for a long time, and hopefully with a lot more alcohol than is permissible at 10 o'clock in the morning. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to just talk about two things. One is the link between politics and multilateral trade agreements, and the second will be this business of the Quad. You're right, it's probably Freudian that we didn't mention it. People don't, outside of Washington, I think, don't grasp how strongly bipartisan the position is against multilateral trade agreements in general. And that has more to do with changes in the Republican Party. The Republican Party used to be the party of multilateral trade. The Republican Party used to be a party based mostly in business, which tended to be very moderate. That's gone, at least for now. And neither political party is going to want to confront its base over something like this. The Democrats, with their worker and labor standards on the progressive end, are against multilateral trade agreements. And the Republicans have now a base which sees a multilateral trade agreement as giving away your sovereignty, as very nationalistic. So there's no way that they're going to change this. It has to be said, however, I think people sort of overestimate how much really was happening before the United States withdrew from TPP. The Bush administration declined even to enter it. The Obama administration entered it, but never sent it to Congress for approval because they knew Congress would not approve it. So yes, Trump killed it, but it was probably, going to have a very rocky path anyway. But there's another thing too, which is what has happened in the intervening years is the USMCA, or the renegotiation of the US-Mexican-Canada agreement. That is the standard that the United States now will hold all multilateral free trade agreements to. And if you say to the United States, why don't you want to enter the CPTPP or even the TPP, Washington would say, because you aren't going to like what we will want to do when we renegotiate those. Even if the United States agreed to go back into the TPP, they would still insist on renegotiating it to raise those standards. And they don't think they're going to get that in the Asia Pacific region. So they don't see the point. It's just to get very dialogue of the deaf, if you like. Let me say something about the Quad. Specific to Southeast Asia. We remember the famous Outlook paper that ASEAN produced in response to the Quad. That was sort of, well, as long as everybody keeps saying the phrase ASEAN centrality, we'll just move on from here. But basically, Southeast Asia first saw the Quad as simply an attempt for the United States to strengthen its relationship with India. Number one. Number two, they saw it as yet another attempt to pull India into the Asia Pacific, and the Southeast Asian attitude was, well, good luck. We tried to, and it really didn't work. See RCEP. More recently, Southeast Asia has focused on the soft windows of the Quad, the infrastructure, the climate change, and those are probably tailor-made for Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian leaders like that, but they want to see something actually happening in these. And they haven't seen a whole lot happening in the infrastructure, for example. They want to actually see the deals. They want to actually see the Blue Dot Network actually set some standards, and there are now a lot of regional and trilateral infrastructure, this and that, and I think a lot of countries are beginning to wonder if it isn't a lot of old wine into new bottles. So.
Thank you very much. We still have a few minutes left, and Don's asked us has a comment from Mason. I'll let you look at that, and I guess what I want to suggest to you is, if we want to look at this in a larger sense and sort of survey the first 2 years, to my mind, what we've seen is sort of a transition in thinking in Washington, where we've acknowledged in the course of over the Trump administration, the end of the Obama administration, and into the Biden administration, that we are engaged in what is an intensifying geopolitical conflict or competition, and that I think that reality has sunk in and seems to dominate decision-making in most capitals around the world, to varying degrees. What seems to me less clear is the argument or the understanding in Western capitals that we're no longer the good guys necessarily, and thus that what's really incumbent upon so many of these administrations in Washington and elsewhere is aggressively making the case, as Catherine, I think, was just alluding to with the Blue Dot Network, with the provision of public goods through the Quad, is the case that we are the good guys. And the assumption, we've assumed that that's the case. And I'm no longer convinced that's true. And essentially addressing these questions of provisions of public goods, whether it be the economic goods predominantly in Southeast Asia, or the security goods up in the Northeast. And I think that the degree to which the Biden administration has acknowledged this new reality and then actively moved to address it seems to me to be one of the biggest questions. And then the degree to which the allies, again, and become part of this. And I want to repeat the question that you sort of alluded to, the answer to which you alluded to, that didn't any of you address, was the way that we can credit the Biden administration for acknowledging, if you will, the changed geopolitical circumstances of American power and that of its allies and partners and its adversaries, and the degree to which it is prepared to devolve some responsibilities and leadership, and whether we are demonstrating, in conjunction with this need for a new political narrative, and this could be part of it, the need to really rethink our relationships with these allies and partners in ways that empower them, and then speak to a new structure of alliance relations within the region and more broadly in the world. And I'd invite each of you, if you would, to think a little bit about that and take 2 or 3 minutes, if you don't mind, and then we'll probably have to wrap it up and call it a day. But so, Rob, I'll start with you.
Yes, Pacific Forum recently took part in a dialogue in Singapore, and I believe what was reported back to me was that there was a lot of discussion about how much Taiwan in particular should be prioritized, and also what the general sentiment among the audiences there was. And what was reported back to me was that the focus that the United States has on Taiwan struck the Southeast Asian attendees as disproportionate. And also that by and large, the mantra, they even came up with an acronym for it, was "Don't make us choose." This has been a recurring theme, I think, in the last couple of years, especially in the time that I've been at Pacific Forum, not only for Southeast Asia, but these days increasingly for the Pacific, which is that the United States is really struggling to establish itself in these regions, given its reputation. And as a consequence of that, it is increasingly relying on its allies that don't share the same baggage, such as Australia and Japan. Getting Korea to take a more active role in these regions would be quite helpful as well. There's also a sentiment I've encountered in Washington and elsewhere that the Moon Jae-in administration really ceded its role as a potential regional leader as well during this time, and that it has really been overshadowed by Japan in the last few years, especially thanks to Abe Shinzo's efforts.
Great. The acronym DMUC, Don't Make Us Choose, actually is credited to Don Emerson of Stanford, who was not at the conference and has written about that, but so I can't violate Chatham House rule by acknowledging that. Mason, you're up.
Yeah, I just want to echo the last thing that Rob just said about to the degree to which in some ways it seems like Japan has eclipsed Korea, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that, which Rob got to. We could talk more about that another time, I hope. So just briefly to try to get to your last point, Brad. I think it's a really excellent one, and I don't think that the jury is in yet. I don't think we know the answer to how this is going to play out. I mean, if we're looking forward to the next 2 years, I mean, what I see, you're talking about devolving more responsibility, to allies and partners in the region. I think that there's some truth to that, and I think it probably in a better world would be even more so. And that would happen both from the Biden administration, but also from the local allies and partners here, taking more responsibility, even more than they already, are in terms of their increase in that area. And, having, fewer thoughts in the back of their head of the viability of continuing to free ride or cheap ride or whatever term you want to use. But I sort of see a divergence here. And again, this goes back, I think, for me, which is kind of the through line on pretty much everything I've said, and that is there's really a divergence, I think, between what we're seeing in the traditional security domain versus what we're seeing in the economic statecraft domain. And South Korea, even under Moon Jae-in, was increasing its defense expenditures. Japan obviously has now come on board with this, doubling of 1 to 2% of its GDP. Again, we'll see if that plays out, but at least that's what is kind of supposed to happen. Other countries are taking more responsibility, and in some cases, the United States, Australia being one of them, obviously. The United States has, for instance, with maritime domain awareness in the Pacific, also, I think, empowered states, through technology and through through working strategically with partners in the region to try to improve that area, which is important for them, whether it be because of fishing or environmental issues or sovereign maritime territory issues. So I think in the security space, we've seen some improvement in this devolution of responsibility, and I think that the downside of that a little bit, as I said, is the arms race and how we're going to control that going forward. And no one seems to have a good answer to that. But that's a tough question in the first place. But then on the economic side of the dimension, I mean, I don't really see this as devolving so much as it is the United States telling other countries, you need to do this, and you have a stick if you don't, and no carrot if you do, or at least not much of a carrot. And that doesn't seem so much like a devolution of responsibility to me as it seems like throwing your weight around. And it may be a fine line between those two, and maybe this is something that can be recalibrated, relatively easily. But at least to me, it doesn't seem like this is so much of a devolution of responsibility as it is the fact that the United States has leverage and is using it. And that's what great powers do, but that can produce backlash, and that's my concern going forward.
I'm reminded of that scene in Spinal Tap where it says, such a fine line between clever and stupid. Catherine, last word.
Okay, I have two last words. One is I started out as a Thai specialist, and I cannot count the number of times in the past 18 years since the 2006 coup that I have said or written that Thailand has been internally focused with political instability and therefore does not react in its foreign policy, or does not have the same kind of foreign policy it had before then. I never thought I would say this, but that describes the United States, and that describes the United States for the past 4 or 5 years. We still are racked by political instability. I'm amazed we have a foreign policy at all, but that's just my own particular view. But the point there is that people always ascribe more intentionality to things than actually is the way that policy gets made. And we are particularly not well placed at this point in time to have that kind of intentionality. But I want to say something about the word ally, because it's a difficult word for Southeast Asia. But more generally, Trump was broadly anti-ally and Biden was broadly pro-ally. Both of them probably were talking about Europe and not Asia in that policy. And the allies that Trump most wanted to alienate were the European allies. The allies that Biden first wanted to build bridges again with were Europe. And then what happens in 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. And of course, you're going to put more emphasis on that. But the word ally in Southeast Asia is extremely problematic when it comes to US security policy. Our two treaty allies in the region are not our strongest security relationships. Our strongest security relationship, without question, is with Singapore. And although I think things are improving with the Philippines, the momentum are in the emerging relationships we have, a very cautious one with Vietnam, which has built-in brakes on both sides, but if it sees fruition, will be a quite important security relationship that we have in Southeast Asia. We have a lot of security cooperation with Malaysia that almost never is mentioned in the course of things. So the ally does not really fit. The ally formulation does not fit in Southeast Asia. And we have been in drift in the US-Thailand alliance for 2 or 3 decades. So again, it's just very difficult to apply that to Southeast Asia. But I would just say that I think that we are stovepiped. We always are. I mean, even within the Asia community, we are stovepiped. If you're a Japan specialist, China specialists tend to bristle if you say something about China. If you're a Southeast Asia specialist, you're not even allowed to talk about Northeast Asia. I say this as the former deputy director of the Center for Northeast Asian Policy Studies in Brookings, because I was a Southeast Asianist and they didn't know what to do with a Southeast Asianist, so they made her a deputy director for Northeast Asia. So anyway, that said, I think we need to look at the whole broader scope, which it really is the European theater now, the past year that has really taken up most of the policy attention. And I think US policy towards Asia suffers, but it's almost inevitable.
Thank you. Time is just about up. I would just note that I always try to make it a point of referring to allies and partners as a way of sidestepping your concern, Catherine. And I would also note, I think that the plans, if memory serves, were that Trump was quite eager to pull out of South Korea if he had the opportunity. So I think the nervousness there was quite real. But these are conversations for another time. I want to thank, please, all of you. Please join me in thanking our 3 panelists for, I thought, were putting up with my rude and boorish questions, and with providing us, I think, some really good insight and sticking to the topic. I would urge all of the attendees and everyone listening that there are deep dives on many of these questions, on China-Taiwan relations, on U.S. or China-Southeast Asia relations, et cetera, all in other chapters of Comparative Connections, which I think is just an outstanding resource. And I urge everyone to take a look at it on a regular basis for just good insight, updates, and just fine work. And Rob, I'm going to turn the floor back over to you for any last words, but thank you all for joining us today.
Yes, thank you, Brad. Thank you for spending your morning with us, sharing your very able moderating. And I want to thank both of my fellow co-panelists for sharing their insights with us. I want to thank everybody who was here and who submitted questions and contributed to this enlightening discussions. And of course, if you want to get a much deeper and more fulfilling, I'd say, sample of the insights that this panel has, please come to our website at cc.pacforum.org, where you can download the entire chapter in PDF form if you want, or you can read it there online. We hope that you will read Comparative Connections and cite it in your own work, and also if you use this to spread the word about the work that we are doing here. And if you want to support the journal, support more events like these, and help us grow, please contact us at development@PacForum. We have a range of options that you can use to help us. So thanks again to everybody, and we will see you again in the near future. Please stay well and stay safe.